It all started in a cave. Most of these stories do. This one was on the Indonesian island of Flores. The cave is called Liang Bua. In 2003, a team of archaeologists, a mix of Indonesians and Australians, were digging there. They weren't looking for a new kind of human. They were looking for evidence of the first modern humans to reach Australia. They were digging through layers of dirt, each layer a page in a history book going back thousands of years. And then they found it. A skeleton. It wasn't a modern human skeleton. It was strange. Well, the skull was incredibly small. The whole skeleton, if you put it all together, would belong to an adult that stood about 3.5 feet tall. The team's first thought was that it was a child, a modern human child. But then they looked at the teeth. The teeth were worn down. They were adult teeth. The bones were fused in a way that only happens in adults. This was a fully grown person, a tiny fully grown person. They nicknamed the skeleton LB1 for Liang Bua 1, but everyone soon started calling her the Hobbit, after the small people from J.R.R. Tolkien's books. The name stuck. It was perfect. Here was this tiny human living in a cave on a remote island. It felt like something out of a fantasy story, but this was real. The skeleton was real, and it was about to throw a huge wrench into our understanding of human evolution. The first big question was simple. What was it? The science world split into two camps. One side said this wasn't a new species at all. They argued LB1 was a modern human, a Homo sapiens, with some kind of medical condition that stunted her growth. The other side said, no, this was something else entirely. This was a new species of human, Homo floresiensis. The disease theory was the first hurdle. It seemed plausible. A small person with a small head. Maybe she had microcephaly. This is a condition where the brain doesn't grow to a normal size, leading to a small head and often developmental issues. It seemed to fit. The skull of the Hobbit held a brain about the size of a grapefruit. That's tiny, comparable to the brain of an early human ancestor like Lucy, an Australopithecine who lived millions of years earlier. For a human living just tens of thousands of years ago, it was unheard of. So the microcephaly idea gained some traction. Other theories came up too. Maybe it was Laron syndrome, a type of genetic dwarfism. Or maybe it was a condition caused by a lack of iodine in the diet called cretinism. These were all attempts to explain the Hobbit away, to fit this strange discovery into the box of what we already knew. If it was just a diseased modern human, then our family tree could stay neat and tidy. It would be a sad story about an individual, not a revolutionary story about a lost branch of humanity. But the evidence didn't support the disease theory, not really. For one thing, the team at Liang Bua kept digging. And they found more bones. They found bones from at least 9 other individuals. All of them were small. It's one thing for one person to have a rare genetic disorder. It's another thing entirely for a whole population of them to have the same one. The odds were just too low. This wasn't a sick person. This was a population of small people. Then they looked closer at the skeleton of LB1. The details were all wrong for a modern human. The wrist bones, for example. Your wrist bones have a specific shape that allows for a wide range of motion. The Hobbit's wrist bones were much more primitive. They looked more like the wrist bones of an ape or a very early hominin, not a Homo sapiens. Someone with a growth disorder would still have modern human wrist bones. They'd just be smaller. These were a different shape altogether, and the feet. The Hobbit's feet were huge in proportion to her short legs. She had flat feet. Her big toe was short. She couldn't have walked or run in the same efficient way we do. Her whole body was a strange mosaic. The legs were human-like, but the shoulders were primitive, kind of shrugging forward. The arms were long. The face had no chin, like ours. It was a unique combination of features, some ancient, some more modern, but none of them quite matching a small Homo sapiens. The brain was another key piece of the puzzle, yes. It was small. But when scientists made a virtual model of the inside of the skull, an endocast, they saw something amazing. The brain wasn't just a shrunken version of a modern human brain, it was organized differently. Certain areas, particularly in the frontal lobe, were surprisingly well developed. These are areas we associate with planning and complex thought. So, this wasn't a malformed brain. It was a small but potentially powerful brain, wired in its own unique way. The evidence piled up, the tools found with the Hobbits, the discovery of more individuals, the detailed anatomy that just didn't fit. The scientific community slowly came around. The Hobbit was real. Homo floresiensis was a new and very strange member of our human family. So if it was a new species, where did it come from? This question was even bigger than the first one. The answer likely lies in a phenomenon called the island roll, or insular dwarfism. It's a pattern we see in evolution all over the world. When a large animal gets stuck on an island with limited resources, it tends to shrink over many generations. There's not enough food to support a big body, and often there are no large predators to worry about, so being big is no longer an advantage. We see this with pygmy mammoths on islands off California and dwarf elephants on islands in the Mediterranean. Flores was the perfect place for this to happen. The island was a lost world. At the time the hobbits lived there, it was home to dwarf elephants called stegodon. These were once large mainland animals that had shrunk down to the size of a cow. But the island rule can work the other way too. Small animals with no predators can become huge. On Flores, there were giant rats the size of a small dog. There were also giant marabou storks tall enough to look a hobbit in the eye. And there were Komodo dragons. The hobbits shared their world with dragons. The most popular theory for a long time was that the hobbits were descended from Homo erectus. Homo erectus was a successful globe-trotting human ancestor. They were the first to leave Africa in a big way, spreading all across Asia. They were tall, they had brains much larger than the hobbits, though still smaller than ours. We know they lived in the region on the nearby island of Java. The idea was that a population of Homo erectus got stranded on Flores, maybe 1 million years ago. A tsunami could have washed a small group ashore. Once there, they were trapped. And over hundreds of thousands of years, they began to shrink, their bodies got smaller to cope with the limited food, and their brains, which are very energy-hungry organs, got smaller too. They evolved into Homo floresiensis. This theory made a lot of sense. It was a neat story of adaptation, a classic tale of island evolution. For years, it was the leading explanation, but then the story got even weirder. The primitive features of the Hobbit, like those wrist bones and the strange shoulder, just didn't fit well with Homo erectus. Homo erectus was more advanced than that, so a new, more radical idea emerged. What if the hobbits didn't descend from Homo erectus? What if their ancestor was an even older, more primitive hominin? Someone more like Homo habilis, or even an Australopithecine like Lucy. This was a bombshell. Those hominins were thought to have been confined to Africa. The idea that one of them had made it all the way to Southeast Asia was revolutionary. It would mean that a very ancient lineage of human, a kind of walking fossil, had survived in isolation on Flores for nearly 2 million years, while the rest of the world saw the rise and fall of other human species, including our own. We don't have the final answer to this question yet. We haven't found the bones of the Hobbits' direct ancestors on Flores. But the evidence from the Hobbit skeleton itself points more and more towards this older origin. It suggests our family tree is in a straight line, marching towards us. It's a messy branching bush with strange side shoots that survived in forgotten corners of the world. The Hobbit was one of those side shoots, a relic from a much earlier chapter of the human story. So, what was their life like? They were survivors. They lived on Flores for at least 100,000 years, and their ancestors likely for much longer. They lived in a world full of danger. They had to watch out for Komodo dragons. They hunted. The evidence is clear on this. In Liangbua Cave, alongside the Hobbit bones, archaeologists found the bones of dwarf stegodons, and these bones had cut marks on them. The Hobbits were hunting and butchering animals many times their size. To do this, they made stone tools. The tools they made were simple. They were flakes of stone, knocked off a core. They weren't as sophisticated as the tools modern humans or even Neanderthals were making at the same time elsewhere in the world. But they were effective. They were good enough to get the job done. This raises a fascinating point about intelligence. We often link brain size directly to intelligence. We think big brain equals smart. The hobbits challenged that idea. They had tiny brains, but they were doing complex things. They were making tools, they were hunting in groups to take down big game, they were likely using fire. They were surviving in a tough environment for a very, very long time. It suggests that the way a brain is wired might be more important than how big it is. The Hobbits were a success story, a long, successful story of survival against the odds. But they are not here anymore. Which brings us to the final, biggest question. What happened to them? When the Hobbits were first discovered, the dates were astounding. The initial analysis suggested that the skeleton of LB1 was about 18,000 years old. Other remains in the cave seemed to be as recent as 12,000 years ago. This was shocking. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in that part of the world in Australia at least 65,000 years ago. If the Hobbit dates were right, it meant that they had shared the island of Flores, or at least the region, with us for tens of thousands of years. It was an incredible idea. Two human species living side by side, almost into the modern era. It made everyone wonder, did we meet them? What happened when we did? Did we trade with them? Fight with them? Did we wipe them out? The story was dramatic. The last stand of an ancient human lineage against the new arrivals, us. But science is a process of constant reevaluation. As scientists studied the cave more, they realized the geology was complex. The water flowing through the cave over thousands of years had moved things around. Layers had been eroded and redeposited. The original dating was likely wrong. The Hobbit bones were found in a layer of sediment, but that sediment might have washed in from an older deposit. A new, more thorough dating effort was launched. They used different techniques. They dated the sediments directly above and below the Hobbit remains. They used methods that were not available in the early 2000s. And the new results, published in 2016, changed the timeline completely. The Hobbit bones, including LB1, were not 18,000 years old. They were much older. They were dated to between 100,000 and 60,000 years old. The stone tools made by the Hobbits disappeared from the archaeological record around 50,000 years ago. This was a huge shift, a game changer. The Hobbits didn't survive until 12,000 years ago. They vanished around 50,000 years ago. This new date solved one mystery, the long coexistence. But it created a new one. Because 50,000 years ago is a very interesting time in human history. It's right around the time that modern humans, Homo sapiens, are thought to have been sweeping through Southeast Asia and making their way to Australia. So, what killed them off? There are a few main suspects. The first is the island itself. The Flores is part of the Ring of Fire. It is volcanically active. A massive volcanic eruption is a real possibility. A super eruption could have wiped out the Hobbit population in one go, or it could have destroyed their environment. And the blanketed the island in ash, poisoned the water sources, killed off the plants and the animals they relied on for food. This would have caused a catastrophic collapse of their ecosystem. A small, isolated population like the Hobbits would have been incredibly vulnerable. There is evidence of volcanic ash layers in the cave, so we know big eruptions happened. The timing of one of these eruptions could line up with their disappearance. This is a very strong contender. The Hobbits could have simply been victims of a natural disaster. The second suspect is climate change. The world was going through cycles of ice ages. Even on a tropical island like Flores, these global changes would have had an impact. The climate could have become drier, the forests the Hobbits relied on could have shrunk, replaced by grasslands. This would have changed the types of animals available to hunt. The stegodons they hunted might have disappeared. If the Hobbits were highly adapted to a specific type of forest environment, a rapid change could have pushed them over the brink. This is also plausible, but it's hard to imagine it would have wiped them out completely on its own. They had survived on the island through previous climate shifts. And then there's the third suspect. But us, Homo sapiens. The timing is just too perfect to ignore. The Hobbits disappear from the record around 50,000 years ago. And modern humans arrive in the region right around that same time. Is that a coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. We don't have any direct evidence of interaction between modern humans and Hobbits on Flores. There are no Hobbit skeletons with spear points in them. There are no caves with Hobbit bones mixed in with modern human bones. But we don't need to imagine a violent war of extermination. The end could have been much quieter. Modern humans were a new, highly adaptable, and incredibly successful species. We had more sophisticated tools, we were likely better at exploiting a wider range of resources. When we arrived on Flores, we would have been direct competitors for food and for space. Even if there was no direct conflict, we might have just been better at hunting, better at gathering, better at surviving. Over a few hundred or a few thousand years, we could have simply outcompeted the Hobbits. We ate the food they needed. We took over the best caves. Their population, already small and isolated, could have dwindled and faded away. There's another possibility too. We might have brought diseases with us. The Hobbit population on Flores was isolated for a very long time. They would have had no immunity to the germs that modern humans, who had come from the large interconnected populations of Africa and Asia, carried with them. A new disease sweeping through the Hobbit population could have been devastating. We've seen this happen throughout history, when isolated human groups are contacted for the first time. The results are often tragic, so what's the most likely answer? It's probably not just one thing. It's likely a combination. Imagine the Hobbit population was already struggling. Maybe a big volcanic eruption had disrupted their environment and reduced their numbers. Maybe the climate was changing, making food harder to find. They were a species on the edge. And then a new kind of human arrived on the island. A human that was taller, had more advanced technology, and carried new diseases. This final pressure could have been the thing that pushed them over the edge into extinction. It's a story that has played out again and again on our planet. A long-established species, perfectly adapted to its world, is suddenly faced with a new competitor and a changing environment. And it just can't cope. The story of the Hobbit doesn't quite end there, though. There is a strange and fascinating epilogue. On the island of Flores, there are local legends, stories told by the people who live there now. The stories talk of small, hairy, human-like creatures that lived in the caves. They call them the Ebugogo, which means something like the grandmother who eats anything. The stories say the Ebugogo were small, walked with an awkward gait, and would murmur to each other in their own language. The legends say they would sometimes steal food from the villagers. The stories get very specific. They say the last of the Ebugogo were still around just a few hundred years ago, before the Dutch colonists arrived. Is it possible? Could these be folk memories of Homo floresiensis passed down through countless generations? Could the hobbits have survived much later than the archaeological evidence suggests, living in small pockets in the deep forest? Most scientists are skeptical. 50,000 years is a very long time for a story to survive. It's more likely that the Ebugogo are just folklore, myths, created to explain the mysteries of the forest. But you can't help but wonder. It's a tantalizing thought. The idea that our species might have shared the world with another kind of human until very, very recently. The discovery of the Hobbit of Flores changed everything. It showed us that the story of human evolution was far more complex and interesting than we ever thought. It wasn't a simple ladder, with primitive apes at the bottom and us at the top. It was a tangled bush with many different branches, and we, Homo sapiens, are just one of those branches, the last one left standing. The hobbits were a testament to the power of evolution to produce incredible and unexpected forms of life. They were a human experiment run in isolation on an island for 1,000,000 years. They show us that there are other ways to be human. You don't need a big brain to be a successful toolmaker and hunter. You don't need a tall, long-legged body to spread across the world, or at least across your own world. The search continues. Scientists are looking on other islands in Southeast Asia, like Sulawesi and the Philippines, for more evidence of these lost humans, and they have found some. On the island of Luzon in the Philippines, they found the remains of another small-bodied species, Homo luzonensis, who also had a strange mix of primitive and modern features. It seems the Hobbit of Flores wasn't a one-off. The islands of Southeast Asia may have been a cradle for diversity in the human family, a place where archaic lineages held on long after they had vanished elsewhere. So what happened to the Hobbits of Flores? The final answer is, we don't know for sure. The evidence points to their end coming around 50,000 years ago. The cause was likely a perfect storm of environmental change, a volcanic catastrophe, and the arrival of a new formidable competitor, us. Their story is a powerful reminder. We weren't always alone on this planet. For most of our history, we shared it with other kinds of humans, and their disappearance, whether we cause it directly or not, is a part of our own story. We are the survivors, the last humans left, and the bones of the Hobbit, resting in a museum, are a silent testament to the lost worlds and the lost relatives we left behind.